The afternoon sun over the Solomon Islands was soft and golden when Lieutenant Katio Yamada first saw the strange twin boom shape hanging in the distant sky. His Zero felt light in his hands, as it always had. For a year and a half, this little fighter had been his sword and his shield, unmatched in agility and grace. The American aircraft that hovered more than 1,000 yards away looked bulky and remote, a curiosity rather than a threat. In those first seconds, Yamada believed he was safe. If you enjoy these kinds of hidden stories, the quiet engineering decisions and forgotten combat reports that changed entire theaters of war, then take a moment right now to subscribe to my channel WW2 Untold Battles, so you do not miss the next deep dive into the weapons and warriors of that conflict. Yamada's illusion of safety lasted only a heartbeat. Without warning, his wingman's Zero shuddered as if struck by an invisible hammer. White smoke burst from the engine, cowling and twisted backward in a sickly trail. The radio filled with confused voices. No enemy fighter had closed in, no American had come charging into the classic turning duel that Japanese pilots understood so well. The twin-boom silhouette still seemed far away, still distant, still harmless. Then Yamada heard his wingman gasp, one word half choked by static: "Monster!" Within moments, the lightning banked away, untouched, leaving behind only falling wreckage and shock. It had never entered what Japanese pilots thought of as fighting range. No swirling dogfight, no close-in duel, just sudden death arriving from a distance that should have been safe. It was not the first time it had happened, and it would not be the last. Throughout the Pacific, experienced Imperial Navy pilots who had survived countless engagements were being torn from the sky before they even understood that a battle had begun. Their commanders demanded answers. Intelligence officers combed through charred metal and scorched aluminum, interviewed shaken survivors, and questioned captured American aircrew. When they finally examined intact Lightning wrecks, what they found seemed almost disappointing. Standard weapons. 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 1 20mm cannon. No huge experimental gun, no mysterious rocket, no strange, oversized shell. Everything about the ammunition looked ordinary, and nothing in the manuals suggested it should still be deadly much beyond 400 yards. Yet American pilots were killing reliably from twice that distance. The secret did not lie in some magical bullet. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds that tore into Japanese aircraft were lethal but familiar, nor did it lie in some bizarre piece of classified chemistry hidden inside the shells. The truth was at once far simpler and far more elegant. It was a matter of geometry, of how the guns were arranged and how their projectiles traveled through the air. For months, Japanese engineers refused to believe that such a modest change could produce such devastating results. By the time they fully understood, it was far too late. The Lightning had already played a major role in breaking Japanese air superiority across wide stretches of the Pacific. To appreciate why the P-38 Lightning became so deadly at long range, you first have to understand a problem that haunted almost every fighter pilot of the Second World War. That problem was gun convergence. Imagine that you are a Spitfire pilot over the English Channel in the summer of 1940. Your fighter carries 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing. On paper, the firepower sounds fearsome. In reality, if those guns are pointed straight ahead, the streams of bullets from each wing will pass by on either side of an enemy aircraft without ever meeting. To make them useful, ground crews adjust each gun so that its bullets angle slightly inward and upward. They cause all 8 streams to cross at a chosen distance out in front of the aircraft. This crossing point is called the convergence range. British pilots often chose 250 yards. Many American pilots preferred 300 to 400 yards. At that exact distance, if you place an enemy aircraft inside your gun sight and hold the trigger down, all 8 guns overlap in a cone of fire, no larger than a bomber's fuselage. The effect is horrific. For a brief instant, the target passes through a storm of bullets so dense that major structural failure is almost guaranteed. When everything lines up, wing-mounted guns can be devastating. However, convergence is both essential and cruelly limiting. Move closer than that sweet spot, and the bullets have not yet crossed. At 200 yards, they may still be flying past on either side of the target's body, slashing through wingtips or empty air. Move farther away, and the streams have already crossed and begun to diverge again. At 500 yards, the pattern has widened so much that many bullets fly harmlessly around the target. In practice, a pilot has perhaps a 100-yard window where his guns are truly lethal. Outside that zone, he is spraying metal in hope rather than in confidence. This narrow window forces hard choices. If you expect to fight nimble enemy fighters in twisting dogfights, you set a close convergence, perhaps 200 to 250 yards. If you expect to attack large bombers, you may choose 350 or even 400 yards to give yourself a little more reach. You cannot have both at once. Optimizing for one kind of fight always means compromising performance in the other. Push even farther out, and the situation becomes worse. At 600 yards, the bullet pattern from wing-mounted guns can spread to something close to the width of a bomber's wingspan. At 800 yards, you may fill a broad patch of sky with tracers, but you are no longer directing focused energy at a specific point. You are hoping that the enemy simply flies through your fire by chance. Every extra second you spend closing the distance while under defensive fire raises the odds that you will not live long enough to get your perfect shot. German fighter pilots learned this bitter arithmetic while attacking tight American bomber formations. To inflict serious damage, they had to close to around 300 yards, boring straight through curtains of machine gun fire from multiple turrets. American escort pilots, whether flying P-40, P-39 or later P-51 and P-47, faced the same tyranny of geometry. They too had to drive their fighters dangerously close before their guns could do the work. Except for the P-38. The Lightning began life in 1937 as an answer to a challenge that bordered on impossible. The United States Army Air Corps issued a set of requirements for a new interceptor. It had to reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It had to cruise at 360 miles per hour at a time when many fighters were still struggling to reach 300. No engine in American production could meet those demands alone. A conventional single-engine design simply could not get there. Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed responded with something that looked at first glance almost alien. Instead of a single fuselage with an engine in the nose, they drew a twin-boom aircraft. 2 Allison liquid-cooled engines sat in slim nacelles, each nacelle flowing back into its own tail boom. Between them they placed a small central pod carrying the cockpit and the armament. Turbo superchargers nestled in the booms fed dense air to the engines at high altitude. The main landing gear retracted into the nacelles. The layout solved several engineering problems at once. Almost as an afterthought, it solved the convergence problem as well. Because the pilot was seated in that central pod and the propellers spun far to each side, the nose was free to carry all of the weapons. There were no guns in the wings. There was no need to angle anything inward from a distance. 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm Hispano cannon could all be clustered in a tight group directly in front of the pilot's eyes, all pointing straight along the center line of the aircraft. When the prototype XP-38 first flew in January of 1939, it stunned observers with its speed. Test pilot Ben Kelsey pushed it past 400 miles per hour performance that placed it among the fastest aircraft in the world. Few realized that the compact group of gun barrels in the nose would eventually matter just as much as the twin roaring engines behind them. By late 1941, the first combat-ready models were rolling off assembly lines. Final armament settled into the now classic pattern, 4 machine guns with their muzzles staggered slightly so that ammunition would feed smoothly, and the cannon angled a little upward to match the fall of the machine gun trajectories at typical combat ranges. On paper, the weapons were no more powerful than those of many other fighters. In practice, their placement changed everything. Frontline pilots did not understand that at first. When the 39th Fighter Squadron at Port Moresby received new P-38F Lightnings in December of 1942, many of its men eyed the twin-boom giants skeptically. They were used to compact P-39 fighters and nimble Japanese opponents. The Lightning seemed large, heavy, and ungainly, a machine built for straight-line speed rather than the tight turning contests they were accustomed to fighting. Some whispered that it was too big to survive against agile Zeros. Then they flew their first combat mission. In that initial major engagement, the squadron claimed 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of a single Lightning. The raw ratio was impressive, but it was not the factor that most surprised the pilots. What truly unnerved and then excited them was how the kills occurred. Men who had been trained to hold fire until 200 or 300 yards now found themselves squeezing the trigger at 700 or 800 yards, almost as an experiment, and seeing enemy fighters begin to smoke and break apart before they came anywhere near their traditional convergence zones. Lieutenant Richard Bong, who would later become the highest-scoring American ace of the war with 40 victories, recalled opening fire on one opponent at about 800 yards. He saw his tracers walking directly into the enemy aircraft. By the time he reached 500 yards, the target was already ablaze. What he was doing seemed to defy everything he had learned about air gunnery, yet it kept working. Other pilots reported the same experience. They would line up behind a Japanese fighter, squeeze the trigger at ranges that training manuals described as wasteful, and watch solid streams of hits rip through the target. The Japanese, for their part, were horrified. Pilots who had grown used to managing their own convergence settings and timing their attacks on vulnerable points in bomber formations now found themselves dying in ways that made no sense. They were being hit before their own guns could reach effective range. Reports from the front described enemy fighters that never closed the distance, never tried to dogfight, and yet somehow killed from impossibly far away. It seemed at first that the Americans must have developed some kind of longer-ranged ammunition. When Japanese intelligence units finally examined the wreckage of downed Lightnings, they found nothing of the sort. The machine gun belts were filled with familiar types: M, 2-ball rounds for general use armor-piercing incendiary rounds, combining hardened steel cores with small charges that burst into flame on impact, and regularly spaced tracer rounds that glowed so that pilots could see where their fire went. The 20mm shells recovered from the cannon magazines were standard high-explosive incendiary projectiles, deadly but not unusual. The muzzle velocities of these weapons, around 2,900 feet per second for the .50 caliber bullets, and about 2,850 feet per second for the cannon shells, were similar to those found on many other fighters. So why were Lightning pilots hitting targets at 700, 800, even 1,000 yards, when Spitfire or P-51 pilots would have been lucky to score more than a scattering of random strikes at half that distance? Answer lay in the geometry of the guns. In a conventional wing gun fighter, each gun is angled slightly inward, so that its stream of bullets will cross the streams from other guns at the chosen convergence range. Before that point, the bullet streams are separated horizontally by the distance between the wings. After that point, they have crossed and are diverging again, spreading apart as they go farther out. At around 150 yards from such a fighter, your bullets may be arranged in a pattern as wide as your own wingspan. At 600 yards, the pattern can expand to 60 feet across or more. You may hit something, but you are no longer directing dense fire at a precise point. The P-38, by contrast, has all 5 weapons clustered within about 2 feet of one another in the nose. The trajectories of the cannon and the machine guns are carefully harmonized, so that between roughly 350 and 400 yards, they overlap almost perfectly. Yet even beyond that, the overall pattern remains tight because the streams begin so close together. At 600 yards, where the bullet cloud from a Spitfire might be as wide as a small house, the Lightning's rounds would still be confined to something like 8 feet. At 800 yards, they are still dense enough to carve a line of destruction through an enemy airframe. The ammunition is identical. The velocities are nearly the same. What changes is the delivery system. Concentrated centerline fire multiplies the usefulness of each shell. It is as though the same number of soldiers who once fired from a long skirmish line are suddenly stacked into a narrow column that marches straight toward the heart of the target. The shell that might have been a random hit in a wide pattern becomes part of a focused burst that eats deep into vital structure. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, credited with more than 60 victories, encountered the Lightning over Guadalcanal in late 1942. At first, he and his fellow Zero pilots were almost pleased. The American fighter looked large and, to their eyes, clumsy. They knew that the Zero could outturn any American aircraft they had yet encountered. Early P-38 pilots who made the mistake of trying to fight on those terms, tightening their turns and letting their speed bleed off, paid dearly and never came home. But American pilots learned. They began to use the Lightning in the way its designers had unconsciously prepared for. They stayed high, they stayed fast, and they refused to be drawn into horizontal turning duels. Instead, they chose when and where to attack. Sakai later wrote that P-38 pilots flying at great heights selected the time and place of battle with disastrous consequences for Japanese formations. He singled out the Lightning's speed, its high-altitude performance, and its remarkable diving and climbing ability as a combination that created problems his fellow pilots could not overcome. His most striking admission had nothing to do with raw performance figures. He remarked that the P-38 broke the morale of Zero pilots. For a man who had survived so many chaotic engagements to write those words is telling. The Lightning did not merely outperform the Zero under certain conditions. It changed the mental landscape of the air war. When P-38 formations cruised at 25,000 feet or more, Japanese pilots watching from below believed that those aircraft were out of range. Then the Lightnings would tip their noses down, and even as they began their dive, their nose-mounted guns would already be firing, reaching out from distances that Japanese doctrine treated as safe. By the time Zero pilots realized that they were under attack, their aircraft were already being hit. Moments later, the Lightnings were climbing back toward thin air that Japanese engines struggled to reach, leaving only burning wreckage behind. Japanese technicians who inspected a relatively intact P-38 wreck in early 1943 finally began to put the pieces together. Their reports translated after the war speak in measured technical language, but the alarm is obvious between the lines. They noted that all of the Lightning's guns fired from the nose, creating a concentration of fire at extended ranges unlike anything in their own service. Pilots reported being hit repeatedly from distances beyond 700 meters. One report concluded starkly that the convergence problem, which limited the effective range of their own fighters, did not apply to the American Lightning. An American pilot could deliver effective fire at any distance at which he could see his target clearly through the gun sight. Japanese engineers understood the solution in theory. They could see that centerline armament removed the convergence curse. In practice, they were trapped by their own design choices. The Zero's slim fuselage had been built with razor-thin margins to save weight. Its strength and range and agility depended on that lightness. There was no space, no structural margin to add heavy guns and ammunition in the nose without rebuilding the entire aircraft from scratch. The wings, by contrast, were already designed to carry weapons. Moving the guns from the wings to the center would have required new fighters that could not possibly reach the front in time. Some Japanese pilots attempted tactical workarounds. They tried to maintain gaps of 500 or 600 yards from P-38s, hoping that they would be safe beyond the usual effective range of American guns. Against P-51s and P-47s, this sometimes worked. Those fighters with their wing-mounted guns still needed to close in to bring their convergence zones to bear. Against P-38s, staying at 600 yards was effectively volunteering to be shot. The ammunition itself became a psychological weapon. Japanese pilots began to realize that as soon as a Lightning's nose swung toward them, they were in mortal danger, no matter how far away the aircraft seemed. The only safe course was complete disengagement, a turn, and dive away from the fight. Even that was unreliable. The P-38's speed and climb often allowed it to catch retreating enemies or strike them during their escape. Men who had once happily hurled themselves into swirling battles now found themselves hesitant, glancing nervously at the sun, scanning for the telltale twin boom shape that meant danger from afar. American pilots, meanwhile, were refining tactics designed to wring the maximum advantage from their weapons. High-altitude patrols became standard, with Lightnings cruising far above Japanese formations. When enemy aircraft were spotted, the P-38s would begin long diving attacks, opening fire from 700 or 800 yards and continuing to fire as they flashed past. The compact cone of bullets and shells meant that even when a pilot's aim was imperfect, his bursts often clipped wings, shattered control surfaces, or ripped through cockpits. Against lightly built, poorly protected aircraft, even glancing hits were often fatal. One mission in particular demonstrated how the Lightning's combination of range speed and long-range firepower could change history. On April 18th of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would be flying to Bougainville for an inspection tour. The schedule, route, and approximate altitude of his transport were all decrypted. To turn that intelligence into action, the United States needed a fighter force that could travel hundreds of miles over open ocean at low level, avoid detection, arrive at precisely the right time and place, fight, and then return. Only the P-38 could do it. 16 P-38G Lightnings were fitted with long-range drop tanks and briefed for a daring wave-top flight of more than 400 miles. They flew so low that their propeller tips sometimes kicked up spray, staying beneath Japanese radar coverage. Navigation had to be exact. There was no room for error. The plan required them to reach a point at a precise minute when Yamamoto's twin-engine Betty bomber would be there flying with a small escort of Zeros. Remarkably, it worked. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, leading the attack element, sighted the two Betty bombers and their 6 Zero escorts almost exactly where and when intelligence predicted. Lanphier turned to engage the escorts. Barber aimed his Lightning at the lead bomber, the one believed to be carrying Yamamoto. The range was still long, perhaps 500 yards or more, a distance at which a pilot in a P-51 might have hesitated and closed further before risking his limited ammunition. Barber did not hesitate. He opened fire, and the stream of .50 caliber bullets and 20mm shells reached out in a concentrated line. Rounds slammed into the bomber's right engine and wing root, chewing through structure and spilling fuel. As Barber closed the distance, he kept firing, walking his bursts across the fuselage. Within seconds, the Mitsubishi began to trail. Heavy smoke then fell out of formation and disappeared into the jungle below. When Japanese search parties located the wreckage later, they found Yamamoto still strapped into his seat, killed either by bullets or by the crash. That long-range assassination required flawless navigation and radio intelligence, but it also depended on the ability to deliver deadly fire from ranges that conventional gunnery doctrines considered marginal. The same shells that many other fighters used became in the hands of the P-38 the precise instruments of a strategic decapitation. To appreciate just how formidable the Lightning's fire was, consider the volume and mix of projectiles leaving its nose. Each of the 4 machine guns typically carried 500 rounds, enough for roughly 35 seconds of continuous firing at about 850 rounds per minute. The 20mm cannon carried around 150 rounds, providing approximately 14 seconds at around 650 rounds per minute. No one ever held the trigger down for that long in combat, of course. Pilots fired short bursts of a second or two, or sometimes longer bursts if they felt sure of their aim. Within those bursts, the belts were meticulously arranged. Ball rounds provided basic lethality against unarmored targets. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined penetration with fire, the hardened cores punching through skin and structure, while the incendiary compounds ignited fuel vapors and hydraulic fluid. Tracer rounds glowed visibly, allowing pilots to correct their aim, which was crucial at long range. The 20mm shells, each weighing around 130 grams and filled with explosive and incendiary material, magnified the damage dramatically when they struck. On paper, none of this was unique. Pilots of P-51s, P-47s, and naval fighters such as the Corsair all used very similar .50 caliber ammunition. Many also carried Hispano 20mm cannons using comparable shells. Yet Japanese pilots described a stark difference. At 600 yards, they could often dodge or survive fire from wing gun fighters. Against P-38s, being inside 600 yards frequently meant death. The reason again was that the Lightning concentrated its projectiles into a compact path rather than spraying them across a wide swath of sky. The combined rate of fire from all 5 weapons exceeded 4,000 rounds per minute. Roughly every 6th projectile was a 20mm shell, with streams of machine gun bullets filling the spaces between. This created what some pilots called a buzzsaw effect. Even if the smaller bullets did not tear a wing off immediately, they often shredded control cables, ruptured fluid lines, shattered instrument panels, or wounded the pilot. Then the heavier shells arriving on the same line exploded inside the already stressed airframe. Dick Bong developed a personal style that took advantage of this capability. He liked to open fire at long range, around 700 yards, and watch his tracers creep steadily across the enemy aircraft. By the time he closed to 400 yards, the target was usually smoking or already breaking up, forced into frantic evasive moves that only made them easier to finish. As American pilots learned to trust their weapons at these distances, P-38 units began to change doctrine. While P-51 pilots were still instructed to hold fire until they closed to around 300 yards, P-38 squadrons were explicitly encouraged to engage whenever they had a clear line of sight, even far beyond traditional convergence ranges. Analysis of gun camera film showed that Lightning pilots firing at 400 yards could achieve hit rates of 20 to 25%, compared to perhaps 5% for wing gunfighters firing the same number of rounds at the same distance. More bullets landed on critical parts of the aircraft rather than being scattered along the wings and tail. The difference was not subtle. It was obvious on the film and brutal in combat reports. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots grew steadily heavier. Early in 1943, one Imperial Navy report described the Lightning with a tone of restrained optimism. Maximum speed slightly exceeded their own Type 1. Fighters' climb rate was a bit better, and turning performance was inferior. The conclusion was that by emphasizing close-range turning combat, Zero pilots could still gain the advantage. 6 months later, reports from the same command told a very different story. They noted that Lightning aircraft consistently engaged at distances beyond normal combat ranges. Pilots complained that they were being damaged or destroyed before they could close enough to use their own guns. One line bluntly pointed out that the morale effects were severe. By mid-1944, some Japanese units were so wary of P-38 formations that they avoided combat unless they heavily outnumbered the Americans. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuro later recalled flying in formation, everything seemingly calm, when suddenly a wingman's aircraft would jerk trailing smoke, while the American fighter still seemed distant. After witnessing this happen more than once, pilots no longer felt any comfort simply because an enemy appeared far away. The Lightning could touch you from any distance, he said, and that knowledge eroded nerves in every sortie. Meanwhile, American units were perfecting the bounce and zoom tactics that played directly to the Lightning's strengths. Groups such as the 475th Fighter Group took off to patrol at altitudes between 25 and 28,000 feet, where their turbo-supercharged engines could maintain power, and many Japanese fighters struggled. When they spotted enemy formations below, they rolled into long diving attacks, opening fire from 800 or even 1,000 yards as they descended through the enemy's level. Major Thomas Maguire, who would finish the war as the second highest-scoring American ace with 38 victories, described how half the time the Japanese never even saw the P-38s until their aircraft were already hit. By the time the Lightnings roared past, they had often destroyed or damaged several airplanes, and they would be climbing back towards safety before the survivors could respond. In this environment, the Zero's original design philosophy became a liability. To achieve its phenomenal range and maneuverability in the early war years, the Zero had sacrificed almost everything in terms of protection. Early models had no armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal structural reinforcement. The airframe was built around the idea that the best defense was never being hit. Against early American fighters that had to close to 200 yards for reliable hits, this approach worked. In a tight turning fight, both aircraft were vulnerable, but the Zero's agility gave its pilots a real edge. The P-38 changed the rules. It no longer needed to accept that close-range duel. It could sit outside the Zero's effective range and reach in with long, accurate bursts. A .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round that might glance off the thick armor of a P-47 would punch clean through a Zero's thin skin, slicing vital cables or spewing burning fuel into the cockpit. A single 20mm shell detonating in an unarmored wing could tear a jagged hole that made recovery impossible. Japanese engineers knew this. Reports from 1943 recommended adding armor and self-sealing tanks, but every pound added cut into the very range and maneuverability that made the Zero competitive. Some later variants did receive limited protection, but by then the Lightning and other improved American fighters were appearing in greater numbers, flown by increasingly experienced pilots. By 1944, the Zero that had dominated the Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942 was being slaughtered at scale. Many of the best Japanese pilots had already been lost. Replacements were less trained, flying against enemies whose aircraft now combined speed, climb, dive, and devastating long-range fire. For them, the P-38's advantage was not an interesting case study in geometry. It was a daily threat that turned the sky into hostile territory, even when no dogfight was in sight. In the end, the most remarkable thing about the Lightning's death ray reputation is how unplanned it was. Kelly Johnson and his team did not sketch the twin-boom configuration primarily to gain a gunnery advantage. They were wrestling with engines, turbomachinery, fuel, and aerodynamics. Placing the guns in the nose was simply the most practical solution given that the propellers sat out on the booms. Yet this practical decision turned out to be revolutionary. By the time engineers, tacticians, and intelligence officers on both sides fully understood what centerline armament at high volume really meant, the Pacific Air War had been transformed. After the war, the numbers told their own story. The P-38 was credited with destroying more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft, more than any other United States fighter in that theater. Over 100 Lightning pilots became aces. The two highest-scoring American aces, Richard Bong with 40 victories and Thomas Maguire with 38, both flew Lightnings exclusively. Japanese analysts studying their own defeat wrote after the war that centerline armament was a crucial lesson. When Japan began designing jet fighters in the late 1940s and 1950s, nose-mounted cannons became the norm. American designers learned as well. The P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational American jet fighter, carried its guns in the nose. Early jet fighters around the world followed the same pattern, abandoning wing-mounted guns in favor of centerline batteries that behaved like the Lightnings without convergence issues. Ironically, the P-38 itself did not enjoy a long post-war career. It was complex, expensive to maintain, and required careful attention from ground crews. As sleeker, simpler types, such as the later P-51 variants and the first jets entered service, the Lightning was gradually withdrawn. By the late 1940s, most had been scrapped or sold to Allied nations. Yet its influence lived on. General George Kenney, who commanded 5th Air Force in the Pacific, later wrote that the Lightning was the finest fighter they had until late 1944. He singled out its ability to hit effectively from extended range as a key tactical advantage that shortened the war by allowing American pilots to attack with less risk and more certainty. The shells themselves, he knew, were ordinary. The results they produced in the nose of a P-38 were not. Today, only a handful of Lightnings still fly, lovingly restored and maintained by museums and dedicated enthusiasts. When they lift from the runway and swing their twin booms into the sky, they carry with them more than polished aluminum and the music of twin engines. They carry the legacy of a simple insight that reshaped air combat. Put your weapons on the center line, fire them straight ahead. Let geometry, not brute force, multiply your lethality. Modern jet fighters from the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor still obey that lesson. Their guns sit on or near the center line. Their missiles launch from stations that avoid the convergence problems of old wing guns. The guidance systems and computers may be infinitely more sophisticated than the simple optical gun sights of World War II, but the underlying principle is the same. Weapons that fire along the aircraft's center line are more accurate at long range. A shell that begins its flight already lined up with the pilot's sight will travel in a path that remains useful across a wide span of distances. The shells that allowed the P-38 to kill from what seemed like miles away were never enchanted. They were standard rounds familiar to armorers on many airfields. What turned them into something extraordinary was the way they were used. American engineers, perhaps without realizing the full implications, at first created a delivery system that solved a problem every fighter pilot faced. American tacticians learned to exploit that system ruthlessly. Japanese pilots, brave and determined, discovered that courage and skill could not always overcome an enemy who could strike them while they still believed themselves safe. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of the Lightning's story. The most devastating advantage on the battlefield does not always come from inventing a brand new weapon. Sometimes it comes from taking the tools everyone already has and arranging them in a smarter way, so that the same shell fired from a different place changes the balance of an entire war. If you would like to keep exploring hidden edges like this, the small technical decisions that tipped great battles and the quiet innovations that terrified veteran pilots, then remember to subscribe to WW2 Untold Battles so that you never miss the next story from the skies of that brutal and fascinating war.